If ever there was the need for a real get-out-of-jail-free card, it's in rural America, where crime does pay if you're the government.
Wait a minute. People get charged for their time in jail like they're staying at a Holiday Inn?
That is the typical reaction people have when journalist Tony Messenger explains pay to stay, a phenomenon in mostly small towns by which mostly small-time criminals are handed big bills for their time in court, their days in jail, and even their months on probation.
The real bad part is they get put back in jail if they can't afford to pay, and that's debtor's prison.
Messenger, who is the Metro columnist for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, has been documenting this practice for years, winning a Pulitzer Prize for his coverage. In his book, Profit and Punishment, Messenger explains how America criminalizes poverty and why it doesn't add up.
The system, when it penalizes people for their poverty, when it punishes their poverty, it actually in many ways makes the system less safe. It's not a math story, it's a human story.
Tony Messenger, thanks very much for being with us today. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
The book is great. It's outrageous in a lot of respects. I don't imagine you made too many friends writing it in some quarters. But let's begin at the beginning. When I saw that it was called Profit and Punishment, I assumed, okay, this is going to be a book about private companies running prisons. There's a little bit of that in there. But that's really not what it's about. It's about something that I guess you could call pay to stay. That I hadn't heard of, and I imagine a lot of people hadn't heard of, but it's rampant in rural areas particularly, not just in Missouri, but across the country. Explain what you mean by profit and punishment.
Well, what really started me into the topics of this book, and pay to stay is a big part of it, is when I discovered starting in 2017, late 2017, early 2018, that in almost every county in Missouri, particularly the rural counties outside of St. Louis and Kansas City, you can be charged for your time in jail. And when you can't afford to pay it, and most of the people who are in jail in this country, 80% of them or so qualify for the public defender system, so they're poor. When you can't afford to pay your bill for your time in jail, you often end up back in jail, being punished for your poverty. Judges come and prosecutors come up with all sorts of reasons for this. Well, you missed a court date, you didn't pay your fine, you didn't pay your bill for your time in jail. But the reality is they're punishing people's poverty. And I was shocked when I started writing about some of the folks who ended up being in this book, in my column in the Post-Dispatch. And one of the things that continued to shock me as I worked more into it is how many different ways our criminal justice system, not just through private companies, but through the use of the government itself, criminalizes the very state of people's poverty, and it leads to them being in jail longer than somebody like you or me might be for doing something similar. Most of us have had a moment in our lives where we've made a mistake, whether it's a traffic error or driving without insurance for a period of time when we're poor, college students or whatever. These things lead to real serious repercussions for people, primarily if you happen to be a poor person in this country. And the most pervasive, the part that is most shocking to people, I think, when they read the book, because like you, they didn't know. Like me, when I started looking into it, they didn't know. It's like, wait a minute, people get charged for their time in jail like they're staying at a Holiday Inn? And yes, that's true, and that's bad enough, but the real bad part is they get put back in jail if they can't afford to pay. And that's debtor's prison. And that's really where, the title of the book comes from.
Yeah, there's something almost Dickensian about it.
It absolutely is. And in fact, I make references to the old debtors' prisons in London, England, and even here in this country, in Philadelphia and St. Louis and elsewhere, where they were legal until the 1800s. We got rid of that. We realized it's absurd. It's obscene. You can't put people in jail in order to get debt out of them. But in fact, we're still doing it, and we're doing it in the name of government.
Well, and the consequences are terrible. You open actually with the story of Brooke Bergen, which I guess is sort of what brought you partially to the story as well. And it's kind of like the butterfly effect. This woman shoplifts, an $8 tube of mascara.
$8 tube of mascara from Walmart.
And the story just gets worse and worse after that.
You know, when I first heard Brooke's story, I had written a couple of stories of folks in this particular circumstance, and I started to recognize this is interesting. People care about this. And so I asked lawyers that I know, send me the worst of these cases, mostly people in the public defender system, because they're the ones who are most aware of this situation. And so I asked public defenders all over the state, send me the worst cases. I want to write about people that end up owing thousands of dollars in these jail bills that they'll never be able to afford to pay. And somebody sent me the case of Brooke Bergen, who lived in Salem, Missouri, in Dent County in the middle part of the state. And she stole an $8 tube of mascara from Walmart. And she ended up spending a year in the county jail, which is bad enough. I think most people think that seems a little harsh for shoplifting, but some folks might think that's okay. But she did her time. She got out of jail, and they gave her a bill for $15,000. And when I saw that, I was just dumbfounded. And when I started writing about Brooke and some of the other people in the book, Amy Murr and Leanne Banderman and so many people that are in this situation, I thought it was a math story. Because everybody can understand $8 tube of mascara, $15,000. You can see that difference and realize that's not just. It's not fair. There's something wrong with that. And indeed, it is a math story, and people did react to this. But Brooke Bergen is the one that really helped me see that it's not a math story, it's a human story. The first time I wrote about Brooke, I wasn't able to track her down. I didn't talk to her. I wrote about her case from court documents and from talking to attorneys. And I didn't take that extra step of really working hard to find her. Well, she found me. Somebody found the column and gave it to her, and she read the column, and she sent me a Facebook message. And I was horrified. I'm an experienced journalist. I know that, back in the old day, you and I still probably remember the old reverse directories that we used to use to find people.
First place
in the
to
phone
go to is
book.
the phone book. Yeah.
We don't do that anymore. What we do these days when we want to find people is we go to social media. We go to Facebook and Twitter and X and Blue Sky and TikTok and Instagram and there's probably 10 other social medias that younger colleagues of mine know about that I don't even know about yet. But that's how we find people these days, and that's how we help tell their stories, because everybody's living their whole life on Instagram and Facebook and et cetera. I didn't take that step with Brooke the first time I wrote about her, and it was a mistake. And she called me on it. But she liked the column, and she was glad that somebody cared. And she told me, she said, you need to come down here because there's lots of people just like me, and the system doesn't care about us. They think we're just cattle, that we're moving through the court system, and they can, take whatever milk money that we have from us. And indeed, that's what the system's doing. And so when I went down and I met Brooke, and I sat in court with her, and I met friends of hers who were going through the same situation, that's what really opened my eyes to what was going on. And it made me realize, both in writing the columns about these folks that I wrote in the Post-Dispatch, and then the folks that I decided from all over the country that I wrote about in Profit and Punishment, the story has to be about their humanity and what the system, what the government is trampling out of them. Not because they're criminals. None of these people are master criminals. These are folks who made minor mistakes, were willing to stand up and take their time in jail to pay for those mistakes. And then the system said, no rehabilitation, no getting back in the community. We're going to keep trampling you as much as we can so we can take a few bucks.
But aren't they, in a sense, then growing more criminals? I would imagine a lot of these people then become so desperate that they turn back to some sort of crime just to survive.
That's exactly what it is. It's it's actually really bad for public safety, and it's one of the reasons why folks on both the left and the right are starting to recognize that we have to stop using our criminal justice system as sort of a backdoor tax collector. There's actually been a study on this now, a couple of them, but one that I reference in the book was an Arnold Foundation study out of Kentucky. And it took a look just at bail, because bail is one of those first places where we criminalize people for their poverty. If you and I get arrested for the same offense and there's a $500 bail put on us and I don't have $500 and you do, you get to go home to your wife and kids and your job, and I don't, whether it's for a day or 2 days, not because I'm a danger to society any more than you, but because you've got a bigger checkbook than I have. And so the Arnold Foundation went in and studied an entire year or two of data in Kentucky. And they took a look at people who had been arrested on low-level misdemeanor crimes, but spent a day, 2 days, 3 days, a week in jail because they couldn't afford the bail. And then they went and followed these folks and looked at recidivism. And folks who were stuck in jail because they couldn't afford to write a check to get out ended up committing more crimes on average than the folks who were let out on their own recognizance. And it makes perfect sense. You're somebody who gets arrested for a DWI, something that happens in our community to upstanding, respectable people who make stupid mistakes, right? You've got a job. And you're in jail overnight, and you lose your job as a trucker, as a dishwasher, as a journalist, as whatever it is that you're doing, and now you can't support your family. Now you can't pay for your rent. Now you can't, you lose your car payment, and whatever the case may be. And so the system, when it penalizes people for their poverty, when it punishes their poverty, it actually in many ways makes the system less safe.
Well, and one of the things you point out in the book is that in some instances, if a person can't pay, instead of just throwing them back in jail, they'll take their driver's license privileges away, which, makes it impossible to go to a job or try to do something to get your life back on track. The whole thing just seems kind of upside down.
In terms of low-hanging fruit, this is one of the easiest fixes that we can make to the current status quo in terms of the criminalization of poverty in America. When I started writing the book, a majority of states in the United States could suspend your driver's license for failure to pay your court debt. So you had court debt like Brooke Bergen, you couldn't afford to pay it down. They could suspend your driver's license without even a hearing to understand exactly what's going on. And as you indicated, it doesn't make any sense. Just logically, I need a car to drive to my job, and I need that job to make money to pay the court debt that you're hanging over my head. When you take my driver's license away, now I can't drive not only to pay the court debt, but to support my family. Well, what happens to folks in this situation? Well, they drive because they need to support their family and they need to pay their court debt and everything else. And then they get arrested and they get criminalized for it, and now they have even worse repercussions. So when I started writing the book, I don't remember the exact number right now, but a majority of states had laws like this. Missouri is one of them. Missouri still does. We're now less than a majority of states in this country that have laws like that. Illinois is one of the states that in the last couple of years repealed theirs. You can no longer just suspend a driver's license for failure to pay court debt. And lawmakers get it. They realize, wait a minute, this doesn't make any, even if you're tough on crime, this doesn't do anything to reduce crime. It doesn't do anything. I'm not going to collect money out of these folks. And besides which, the driver's license, in most of these cases, has nothing to do with their underlying crime. So legislatures all across the country are starting to realize, okay, we can fix that. They're doing some other things too. There are some legislatures out there that are considering getting rid of all of these fines that legislatures put into the criminal justice system and try to collect from people after they're found guilty. That's one of the things a lot of people don't know. You've got a speeding ticket. A lot of people have gotten speeding tickets before. And you look on the back of the ticket after the officer writes you the summons, and it says, okay, I was going, 75 and a 60, and my fine is going to be $75. But then when you call the local municipal court or the state or whoever it is that wrote you the ticket, you find out, you talk to a clerk or whatever, and they say, yes, if you plead guilty, you're going to owe $300 or $400 or $1,000. And you're like, wait a minute, what? This says, well, that's just the fine so that you don't speed again. What the legislature has done, and this is true in every state in America, is the legislature has said, well, gosh, we need money for deputy sheriffs' salaries and their retirement. We need money for our local library. We need money for a domestic violence shelter. We need money for a prosecutor's retirement. Many of these things are good things, but they're the kinds of things that normally you would go to the legislature and you would say, hey, can you add us to the general revenue? We need some more money for this. And, they would prioritize and say yes or no. What legislatures have increasingly done in the past couple of decades is they've said, well, we're not going to raise taxes, so we're not going to get your money that way. But what we have found is if we add a $3 charge to every ticket written in the state, we can raise $3 million real quick. And so one year they add a $3 charge, the next year it's a $1 charge for something else, the next year it's $4 for something else, and that's how a $50 speeding ticket becomes a $500 speeding ticket, and none of it has anything to do with the dispensation of justice. So there is now a movement in the country called End Justice Fees that is supported on the left by the ACLU, on the right by the Koch brothers, and all sorts of folks in between, trying to convince legislatures to say, stop using the courts as a tax collector. If you want to fine somebody for speeding, fine them for speeding, let them pay that, and stop all the other stuff, because we're putting poor people who can't afford to pay that stuff in jail, and you're not really very efficiently raising money anyway, because rather than charging a general tax on everybody, you're only going after the people who can least afford to pay it.
Well, and none of those fees on paper are especially high, but it kind of becomes death by 1,000 paper cuts. They charge you for this and they charge you for that, and it adds up, and that's how someone like Brooke ends up owing $15,000.
It adds up.
I mean, what are they charging these people for?
One of the people who's the main character in my book is a woman named Kendi Kilman. She lived in Norman, Oklahoma at the time I wrote about her. And one of the things I found to really like about Oklahoma is as bad or worse than Missouri in terms of criminalizing its poverty and using the court system to charge people all sorts of things completely unrelated to their offense. But the one thing I liked about Oklahoma is their criminal justice system is more transparent than ours. So when you go click on Kendi Kilman's name or somebody else's name in Oklahoma to see how much they owe, it breaks down every single fee and what's going to the local library district and what's going to the prosecutor's office and what's going to the for-profit probation company that's trying to put you back in jail and what's going to this, that, and the other thing. And it really illuminates when you look at it. It's like, wow, this is insane. Why am I paying this for an offense? Kendi ended up owing about $1,000 for a ticket that she got. She was driving home. A police officer allegedly saw a crack in a windshield, which frankly, the police report and the story and everything doesn't really make a lot of sense. But for whatever reason, Kendi got pulled over. She was driving a car that she had just bought, and the police officer asks if he can search the vehicle. She agrees, and under the carpet in the trunk finds an old pot pipe that doesn't have pot in it but had residue. And the law at the time in Oklahoma was that that's possession of marijuana. And now legal in that state, just like it's legal in this state. And so that adds to the complexity of the story. But she gets arrested for a couple of misdemeanors related to this, taken to jail for where she's cuffed most of the day while she's waiting to sit before a judge, eventually pleads guilty to these minor charges rather than fight them, and ends up owing about $1,000. Well, she's a poor person who lives on disability and lives in public housing and, lives literally disability check to disability check and can't afford to pay. And she tries, does her best, eventually misses a payment. And what happens when you miss a payment, when you owe court debt? You immediately get a warrant out for your arrest. Here in the St. Louis region, we learned about this in a significant fashion in 2014 after the death of Michael Brown. Because what we found is a lot of the young black people who were out there protesting police brutality had been victims of a system somewhat unrelated to the policing, but mostly related to the courts. Because the courts in a lot of cash-strapped North St. Louis towns were using their police department as a fundraising tool. And so somebody would get arrested for a traffic ticket and owe money in Delwood and maybe St. Anne, and then all of a sudden they'd miss a court date and they'd get arrested and taken to this jail for a day and that jail for a day, and that adds up to a lot of injustice over a period of time. Same thing in rural America with poor white people. It's what happened to Kendi Kelman, and in her case, she was smart enough to be paying attention and know when there was a warrant out for her arrest. And she would just go to the court. She would just get a ride or whatever and go to the court and find a judge and sit before the judge and say, I have a warrant out for my arrest because I owe you money. And the judge would say, can you pay the money? And she'd say no. And they'd take the warrant out and they'd add to her bill, because every time there's a new warrant out, they charge you for that too. Add to the bill and send her home. And it's a cycle that poor people can never get off of.
Well, and those North County incidences notwithstanding, one of the reasons maybe that a lot of people in St. Louis, for instance, haven't heard about this is that it's primarily a rural phenomenon, yes?
As it relates to the board bills in the state of Missouri, the people that are charged for their time in jail and then put back in jail because they couldn't afford to pay those bills, that's a rural situation. That's something that even in the legal community, when I started writing about this, people in St. Louis didn't know about it. Because in St. Louis, in Kansas City, in Columbia even, and to some degree in Springfield, the local cities don't charge for time in jail. The law says they can, but historically, it hasn't been their practice to do so because they have a tax base that pays for their jail. They know taxpayers are already paying for it, and the legal community has realized, well, this just doesn't make any sense. Let's not do this. But in almost every rural county in Missouri, with one or two exceptions, that's where the board bills are charged. And it's different in, every state sort of has different culture, but in every state in America, with the exception of New Hampshire, which repealed its law during the time I was writing the book, there is a law in place that allows cities or counties or the state prison system to charge you for your time in jail. And it's an insidious charge, and it's something that most people that I talk to don't understand it and don't think it should exist. But they particularly don't believe people should be punished just because they can't afford to pay.
Do you get a lot of pushback from readers? You've written about this a lot in the paper, and of course the book's been out for a while now. I'm picturing people making the argument something along the lines of, if you can't pay the fine, don't do the crime,
right,
sort of thing.
Right.
Do you get a lot of that?
I get a lot of that, but what's interesting on this particular topic is after a period of time and after some discussion, they start to understand it. When I first started writing about people in this situation, for some I would get those sorts of responses, and I would say, okay, let's look carefully at what happened here. They did their time. They pleaded guilty. They got charged time served. They spent a week in jail, 30 days in jail. In Brooke Bergen's case, a year in jail. So did her time, didn't commit another crime, but yet got put back in jail because they couldn't afford this. So do you think $15,000 is reasonable? And they'll say, no, that sounds pretty okay. So what we're doing now is we're haggling over price, right? And so you agree that these people have served their time and they've done what the system demands of them, Now what? What's the line? Where do we draw the line? What's reasonable? One of the things that I try to talk to people about as it relates to our neighbors who are in jail or prison, and I try to refer to them as our neighbors because the system envisions that that's who they are. There's only a handful of people in jail or prison in Missouri who are, by design, never supposed to get out. They're on death row. They have multiple murder offenses, consecutive life sentences, those sorts of things. But most people, almost everybody in the city jail and the county jail, and most even people in state prison, are supposed to get out and be our neighbors and contribute to society again and get jobs and, live their lives. So if that's true, what do we do to help them to make sure that when they get back into our community, they can do so safely? That makes all of us feel safe and improves our overall level of public safety. Because if we're just going to demean everybody who ever goes to jail and assume that, well, if you can't do the time, don't do the crime. Well, what's the time? What's the reasonable time? And if they serve that time, do we let them back in and do we treat them like human beings again? Or do we just assume that everybody who steals an $8 tube of mascara gets the death penalty? Because if it's not the death penalty, it's something else. So that's part of what the book explores. What is that something else? And what level at that something else punishes them for their crime but not their poverty?
How is the landscape on this changing? Because there have been some court cases and some enlightenment, I suppose, in some quarters about this. Are there states? I know New Hampshire, I think, was one that repealed.
New Hampshire repealed their board bill law, so that was good. The Supreme Court in Missouri ruled unanimously that you can't put people back in jail for being unable to pay their board bills. So that was a good positive reaction. The Idaho Supreme Court ruled unanimously in a similar case that you can't put people back in jail because they can't afford to pay their court debt. So the courts are coming around and the legislatures are coming around by slowly getting rid of these insidious laws that let you suspend a driver's license for failure to pay court debt. But it's hard because the entire criminal justice discussion gets complicated the next time somebody who's out on bail shoots somebody. And we've had that situation happen in St. Louis. And they were out on bail. That judge should have kept them in jail longer. Don't talk to me about criminal justice reform. There's a dead victim now. And we don't have a capacity in America sometimes for separating situations and for using nuance. And so it's become more difficult to discuss the overall concept of ending justice fees in a world in which there's headlines about crime rising, even though, as you know, if you've looked at the statistics in St. Louis, crime's down in St. Louis over the last couple of years. So that's a good thing. But yes, it makes it for a complicated conversation. What helps is having folks on the left, the ACLU, the right, the Koch brothers, actually working together on these issues to try to say, okay, look, let's not criminalize poverty. We can work on that together, even if we disagree on how many years somebody should be punished for stealing a tube of mascara or committing a DWI or something like that. We can disagree on what the reasonable punishment for those crimes is, but we can agree that nobody who's rich or poor should be punished differently because they're rich or poor for that same crime.
Well, I guess anything that brings the left and the right together is, if nothing else, miraculous.
It is. It absolutely is.
And perhaps it will bring an end to the system, or at least certainly make some significant changes. I imagine your book has probably enlightened a lot of people too. Profit and Punishment is the name of the book. Tony Messenger, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you very much for having me.